All right. Thanks, Sue. That was lovely. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I will be sharing my screen with you. My name is Phoebe Jackson. I teach college at physics at John Abbott College. And I'm just going to be the animator today. So I'll do a very brief intro, and then I'll be handing it over to our team.
Phoebe, we don't see your slides.
I know. Do you see them now?
Yeah.
All right, here we are. So today's webinar is titled Better Assessments with Backward Design, Bringing Critical Thinking into the Questioning. And the session is going to be run by a fantastic team of education experts who I'll introduce now. Melissa Sakari is an educator with 20 years of experience, and for the past 7 years, she's been a program manager of BioInteractive at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, where she focuses on learning design and assessment for undergraduate introductory biology courses. And her partner, Rebecca Orr, is a biology professor at College in Texas and an ambassador for BioInteractive, where she works with Melissa on the project they're going to be sharing with us today. And they've also been working on this project with Michael Rodriguez, who unfortunately is unable to join us today, but he has been a major contributor to the work we're going to be hearing about. Michael is the founding co-director of the Educational Equity Resource Center, and he's the Campbell Leadership Chair in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Minnesota. He is also the co-author of the book titled The College Instructor's Guide to Writing Test Items, Measuring Student Learning, which I believe is relevant to today's presentation. So before I leave you in the capable hands of today's team, I'm going to briefly review the basics of backward design. So we're all starting from the same place. But to do that, I'm actually going to start with traditional course design. So traditionally, when we design a post-secondary course, an instructor might start with the content, so the topics that their student needs to learn. Then they move to, okay, how am I going to teach this content? And then finally, all right, how am I going to test or otherwise assess this content? So one problem with this more traditional process is that it doesn't focus on what we want our students to actually learn. Content is important, but content is not learning. So what will our students do with the content? Do we want them to be able to recall facts, solve problems, analyze data, compare theories, make decisions, create products? Okay, what learning do we want them to be able to do? And where do things like critical thinking and knowledge transfer fit into this too? So by focusing on the content rather than what we really want our students to learn, the traditional model of course design often results in a misalignment between what we want our students to learn, what they actually learn in our class, and what we have measured them as having learned. So this is where backward design comes in. When we plan our courses via backward design, we start by determining our learning objectives, what our students should be able to do by the end of our course or unit. So what makes backward design different from traditional course design is not just that we start with these learning objectives in mind, but before we plan how we're going to teach, we first figure out what evidence will show us that students have met these learning objectives. In other words, we plan our assessment next. This helps us better understand what we need to do to help our students meet the learning objectives. So now we're ready to plan our instruction. So without planning our assessment first, we still run the risk that our lessons will not align with our assessments and the learning goals. And that's one of the things that backwards design helps us address. So this idea of alignment or misalignment, I believe, is exactly what today's team of experts is going to help us with. Together, Rebecca Orr and Melissa Sakari are going to discuss this interplay between designing learning objectives and creating assessments, focusing on, I believe, selected response items on tests. So I'm going to hand it over to them now and enjoy the session. I'll just stop screen sharing. There you go, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. I hope that everybody is seeing our slides, and we're really excited to be here. As Phoebe mentioned, I'm Melissa Sakari. Rebecca and I have been working together for 6 or 7 years now. This project particularly since 2019. So we hope to share what we've learned over the last few years with you. And we're going to be using a polling software today called Menti or Mentimeter. And our hope is that you will participate in the polls because that's really going to drive the discussion that we're going to have. And you can participate by going to menti.com and entering that code, or you can click on the QR code on the left-hand side of the slides. So I'll give you a minute to do that. You can also do it on a separate tab or your mobile device, whatever's easier for you. So I'll give you a minute to get onto Menti, and this will also give you access to all of our slides. If folks can give us like a thumbs up or something so we know that you are on there, that would be great. All right, Beth is on. Barbara's okay. I saw a question, a hands up, but it looked like maybe that was an accident. All right, I think for the most part, people who want to be on are on. Thank you. All right, so we hope you enjoy the journey today. You will see this puppy who is no relation to Rebecca or myself. It was a Creative Commons puppy, and my husband felt that I should have used our puppy, but I did not. So for today, we are going to have a couple of things within the roadmap. Basically, we are going to give you a historical perspective of what we've done with this work since 2019, where we are now, and what we hope that this work will lead to. And then we're going to really dive into a practitioner's lens, and Rebecca's going to talk about how can you take these learnings, what we've learned over the last 3 years, and we've like abbreviated it into about 45-50 minutes, and hopefully walk away with better assessments for your students. And then we'll have Q&A at the end, but we'll also have opportunities throughout for you all to ask questions. All right, the very first thing, we got the list of who was supposed to come, but we're really interested to see who's here. If you could share your name, a course or courses you commonly teach, and your particular reason why you came to this session so that we can try to address some of those reasonings of why you're here. Just thank you, Carolyn. You're just interested, and you're bringing an ecological perspective. Nursing, yeah, I saw a fair amount of nursing in the biology. Whoop, whoop. Not that Rebecca and I are biased at all. We're happy you all are here, and we like totally made this a non-biology talk. But Beth, we could talk biology all the time. Let's scroll through. Physics, not one of my favorites, but it's fine. I like to think of physics as just complex chemistry and physics, biology in that sense. Oh, evaluation to pre-service. Hannah, we should catch up at some point too. Oh, another biology. Vera's excited too. And Liz wants to learn more about learning outcomes. We'll talk a little bit in a bit about the difference between when we use learning outcomes versus learning objectives, and how we'll contextualize some of the definitions that we use, because that is that term particularly is highly variable. All right. Great, thank you all for sharing. All right, and then Phoebe talked a little bit about backwards design. We have a little segment in the presentation about backwards design, and we want to determine how much time we need to spend on backwards design given where the audience is. All right, Rebecca, you're going to do that part on backwards design. And it looks like as a collective, it's pretty strong for backwards design, but there is a small proportion of individuals who could benefit just from a brief overview at the very beginning when I transition over to you. Thanks. Yeah, Liz, we love this interactive polling as well. And there's a free version. The version that we are using is not a free version because it gives us an unlimited, well, like 500 to 1,000. I think we're on the 500 plan. But we like it a lot. The free version is not as powerful, but it's great for classroom use. All right. So why are we here? Hopefully our goals are going to align with the reason you showed up. The first thing is I'm going to talk a little bit about BioInteractive's role in professional learning and tool development, specifically for assessing student learning. And then Rebecca is going to spend the majority of time talking about how to use learning objectives effectively. And then we're going to dive into selected response items and how you can use them for, we have use in assessing learning, which is a big delineation that we try to make fairly regularly. It is not just for assessing of learning, what is happening at the end. It's throughout the entire process. And then we hope to, the checklist that we share is really valuable, that you all can walk away with it and work on improving your items for your students. All right. In this context, we're going to define assessment as a variety of methods. We're going to look a little bit at tests and exams, but we want you to think of assessment holistically as a variety of methods to evaluate, measure, and document readiness, progress, and skill acquisition. And then finally, what are the needs of the student? So that's that big using assessment to modify your instruction for your students. All right. So when we started to look into this in 2018, we wanted to see what the literature was telling us about the problem. The first one, Phoebe had mentioned that misalignment, and I really like the Matthews and Mercer Mapstone article. They have two different surveys on there. One survey they give to the faculty, the other survey they give to the students. And what they find is that what educators think they are teaching their students are not in agreement. So that there's a disjunction between what the educator is hoping to do and then what is actually getting transferred to the student. For the references below, I purposefully chose older ones to know that this problem has been researched for a really long time, and it's persistent and pervasive. But when we look at closed response questions, faculty, educators have a really hard time writing closed response questions. It's not something that most people are trained to do. And it's even harder to do it at higher level Bloom's taxonomy. And so we are working on developing a tool to provide an abundance of closed response questions where in the biology realm that will give faculty the opportunity for their students to learn using these questions throughout a course sequence, not just at the end. So how long does it take to write a good question? It takes it an hour, and that's just actually for a good question, not even a good higher level question. So one question takes an hour. And if we think about typical exams, we now have an easy understanding of why faculty might not bring the best assessments to their students and why they hold their good questions very, very close to their pockets, with not necessarily wanting to share them with their students until they're assessing them for a grade because they've worked really hard on those questions. And then Zhang says there's a need for instructors to create and share questions to lower that load that faculty have to present good questions to their students. And I didn't put this one on there, but Jenny Momsen, who's a colleague of ours, looked particularly at biology, and the average Bloom's questions on a typical intro bio exam are like 1.7 or it's like 1.79, I think, on the Bloom's level. So really knowledge recall. But if you ask faculty, they say they're really focused on critical thinking, critical learning in their course. So again, it's another misalignment between the hopes and the practice. All right, what I'm going to share with you pretty quickly here is a survey that we did in 2019, I believe. It might have been late 2018. It might have been late 2018. We analyzed it in 2019. But we had these assumptions from the literature that there was a problem that we wanted to address. So we went to our audience. Our audience is biology faculty at the intro bio 100, 200 level courses. And we asked them a series of questions. I just pulled out the ones that are most relevant to what we're talking about today. But you can see that these respondents reflect the institution type demographics that we see in the United States. So we got a pretty good representation with the 500 survey respondents. So what did we ask them? We asked them, are you using a test bank? And the literature will tell you that test bank questions are relatively lower order Bloom's questions. And we see that the majority, with the exception of 500 plus and 251 to 500, over half of faculty are using test banks for their assessment questions. Then when we look, how many multiple choice questions are you using? Again, it's almost always over 50%, with the exception of those relatively small classes of 11 to 25 students that have a little more flexibility to have open response questions, which makes sense. As a reminder, on the survey, we talk about higher order and lower order questions a fair amount, and they were given, if they weren't familiar with Bloom's level, in the survey, they were able to click on a document that described, well, when we say lower order and higher order, and when we say Bloom's, this is what we're talking about. So when we ask them, how do you rate your ability to write higher order questions? Not surprising, a lot thought they were good and excellent. So over half thought they were good or excellent. We have an awesome community. I'm sure that some of them are excellent and good, but when we did a follow-up survey after they participated in a workshop experience, they reported in the post-workshop, they actually overestimated their ability. And so while these are the focus group and the workshop was a subpopulation of the 505, we believe that that probably translates to the majority of educators are overestimating their ability to write these questions. And you'll get that opportunity to look at that when you look at the item writing checklist shortly. All right, this is a relatively big prompt. I wanted you to see the whole prompt, and I'm not going to read it to you. The key thing is we ask them, if we develop a tool with questions in them, what do you want those questions to look like? And the biggest thing is they wanted them to be those higher level skills of analytical skills and applying information to a novel situation. And that's exactly what we're working on. And then we're almost done with the data for everyone. We'll get into the fun stuff. Rebecca gets to do the fun stuff. I talk about data. Looking at this one, again, we had the assumption that thank you, Liz. We had the assumption that we were creating something that people wanted, but we did this survey prior to the work that I'm about to talk about in a second. And our assumptions were right. Over 50% of the survey respondents said, yeah, they would like a workshop on writing effective questions. All of the other options that are there are things that we typically offer as part of our professional development anyways. So we just wanted to see, is this in line with the other things that we're doing? And if the terminology OER isn't familiar, it's open educational resource. All right, so when we look at this timeline, we started the work in 2018, and we had a core working group of about 15 biology faculty, and then 2 assessment and evaluation experts. And those assessment and evaluation experts were Michael Rodriguez and Tony Albano. And we mapped out a plan. In 2019, we formalized that plan, and we did a workshop guidebook development, which is what Rebecca's going to talk about. That's the practical thing that I think you'll walk away with and really love that tool. And we also apply, when I say we, I need to be very clear. We is not myself. I work for a philanthropy. We did not take any of this money at all. All of the money went to our collaborator partners. It's NSF money. So Scott Freeman, who is the person who introduced me to Saltese, received a $600,000 grant to make validated learning objectives for introductory biology. And Heather Seitz received a RCN, which is a research coordinated network. UBE is undergraduate biology education. It's an NSF grant for $500,000 to do faculty development around assessment writing. Now when I say we took on the task of developing a database that would be able to take the learnings from Heather's work and the learning objectives from Scott's work and make a database that's going to be freely available that has questions aligned to learning objectives. And then we also started to do faculty workshops. Those faculty workshops were primarily led by Rebecca, who's on this call, and Peggy Brickman, who's currently teaching as we are here now. That's why she wasn't able to join us. And they've reached over 700 educators now with these faculty workshops. In 2021, we started with the database development and the LO learning objective validation process, and we continued on with the faculty workshops. In 2022, our hope is we will have an evidence-based teaching guide published on best practices in learning objectives, and we're working on another project on question design. And then also we are planning on publishing the tool that I talked about for free broad use. And then we will, as always, continue to collect more data on the success or not of this project. And this is just a little screen grab of what the tool is going to look like. You would be an educator, you create an account, and once you create an account, you can author and submit questions. The questions that are submitted, their biology, they have to be tied to the learning objectives that are being validated, which when we say validated, it means that it went through a process where enough introductory biology faculty said this is essential knowledge that we determined that it should go into the tool as a learning objective. And you can export the questions, and with this process, if you remember, I'll ask in the chat. Does anybody remember the average amount Farley says it takes to write a question? Let's see. Yeah, 1 hour, Beth, 1 hour. Yeah, so we are paying faculty, once their question has undergone peer review, $50 per question. And so not only will they get compensated a little bit for their question, they'll also be listed as an author within the tool so that they can put it into their CV. All right, this is I think this is my last slide. So you're going to be done with me pretty soon. What we've learned so far, if you liked hearing about the data that we've collected, we have a book chapter coming out from Clemson is publishing a book on faculty development. And we wrote one of the chapters specifically about what I just talked about, which is a workshop. We did a program evaluation to determine how to refine the workshop, and also what do faculty need to know most about learning objectives. And then we have an article coming out, which is a qualitative analysis that's going into the American Biology Teacher on the learnings from that workshop. Rebecca is the lead author on a EBTG, which is an evidence-based teaching guide on writing and using learning objectives that'll publish fairly soon, we hope. And that's through CBE LSE, which is cell biology education, life science education. And then the integrating testing and learning workbook, it is in draft, but we are going to share it with you at the end of this presentation. All right, so before I turn it over to Rebecca, where you all are going to do some of the thinking now, does anyone have any questions? Let me take a question or two at this point if anyone has them. And you can come off mute or you can put it in the chat if you have any questions. Rebecca, I'm thinking they're good. I'm thinking you're in charge.
So we're going to take about the next 50 minutes to talk about some of the concepts that we discussed in this workbook. I want to take a minute to acknowledge my co-authors, Tony Albano and Michael Rodriguez, are our experts on assessment that came and shared some of the principles, primarily from Michael's book. And Peggy, Melissa, David, and I all worked on putting together this workbook that we use, as Melissa mentioned, as the basis for our workshops. So we wanted to start with backward design and just kind of ground ourselves in this concept. As Phoebe relayed, backward design is where we start with the learning objective and we look at what students should be able to know and understand what should they be able to do. You can think of it as the tangible things that you want your students to be able to do at the end of the course. It's your plan. And then we think about how will we know that they've done that they've gotten there? What evidence do we need? And that's what we call assessment. It's important to know that that assessment may be summative, meaning it's an exam, for instance, a final, something that we're looking and said, are they there? But it also can be formative, assessment that we do along the way, which isn't necessarily an exam or a quiz. It may be a discussion, it may be a paper, it may be a gallery walk, anything where you're gathering evidence as to your students' progress. And so you plan these assessments to give you information about how are your students doing in being able to do or perform whatever those objectives are that you set forth. And then you plan your instruction. How are you going to help them get there? What do you need to do to help them practice and be prepared for those assessments where they're giving you evidence of the learning objectives? One of the things we like to really point out is that your data from assessments are going to inform continuous improvement and revision. This data that you gather will help you to refine your instruction as well as your learning objectives. Last summer, I dug really deeply into the literature on learning objectives because we hear a lot of different terms. We hear learning goals, learning outcomes, learning objectives, course outcomes, course objectives. And as we were putting together what did this need to look like in terms of an evidence-based teaching guide to guide instructors based on what we know, we wanted to come up with some terms. And so one of the things we teased out was the difference between a learning objective and a learning outcome. And it's a fine nuance. A learning objective is what the instructor puts together in terms of what kind of performance will the student be expected to do, what kind of criteria, what kind of conditions, with what content. The outcome is what your students show you. And so a lot of times when you'll hear about learning outcomes, that's what the student actually did. And so our objectives is a very much a faculty instructor-based goal, and the outcomes are what we found out from the assessment. Once we teased out learning objectives versus outcomes, I noticed that in the literature, there's a lot of different levels of objectives. We have institutional learning objectives, programmatic learning objectives. Course level learning objectives are often designated by states or by institutions as to what is expected from a course to help with vertical alignment. We're going to focus mainly on instructional learning objectives, which are more specific and descriptive. They're module or lesson specific. They're very student focused, and they guide faculty in planning out the instruction for their entire course. When we look at an effective instructional learning objective, and from now on, every time we say learning objective, we are referring to instructional learning objectives, unless we say otherwise. An effective instructional learning objective will articulate the claims that instructors want to make about the students. And they're intended to identify evidence of what students can do to demonstrate their knowledge, their skills, and their abilities. So they are what your assessments will be planned from. And they aid us in collecting that evidence so that we can inform and revise instruction. And we really want to emphasize that because it's not a static process. It's not something where you start at the beginning of a course and you come up with, this is how I'm going to do my course, and then you don't touch it for the rest of the semester. One of the things Michael said is that these should be behaviorable, measurable, and attainable, which I have found that instructors find is a nice summary for what an instructional learning objective should look like. In writing these, the evidence from the literature says that learning objectives should be well written and avoid ambiguous wording. If they're written in an ambiguous way, it's very hard to measure them. It's hard for a student to know what to do with it. It's hard for an instructor to know where they are in terms of their students meeting those objectives. We recommend that you use Bloom's taxonomy as a framework, that as you're thinking about what you want students to do, you think about using Bloom's verbs that will help students behave at what the levels they need to behave at. And some of those will be lower level Blooms as they gain content that support higher level thinking. But there was a good bit in the literature that talked about how if students are going to need to learn certain thinking skills in order to have a certification or in order to meet programmatic goals, then they needed to have that kind of thinking developed in all of the courses that were leading them to that articulation or to that skill. It should convey the expectations of what a student should be able to do. What are the conditions? What's the criteria? Which brings us to the components of a learning objective. And this will be in the article that we have coming out in LSE. And that is really specifying that a learning objective should state a performance. This is where those bloom verbs come in. And they're really critical that they be used to match what you're asking them to do. We've seen instructors choose high-level Bloom's verbs. They'll find lists where verbs are associated with different levels of thinking, but they're mismatched to what they're actually asking them to do. So you really need to think about choosing a performance and then stating a criteria if it's necessary. And not all learning objectives have a criteria, but if it's necessary, put that criteria in. If you want them to know more than one adaptation, for instance, in this learning objective, state that so that they know that that's one of the criteria that you'll be measuring. The conditions can be the content. The conditions might also be other things. If they were having to make a speech without any sort of materials for a speech class, then you might want to put that it's under those conditions. If they were going to be on stage, or if they were going to be outside versus inside, there could be a lot of different conditions that would be part of a learning objective. Not all learning objectives have to have specific conditions. They might just be content. But the most important thing is that you're stating a clear performance, that behavior that's measurable and that's attainable. Okay, so I wanted to take a minute to go back into Menti and just let you weigh in. Do you use instructional learning objectives, these learning objectives that guide individual classes or sessions in your courses? Wow. This is maybe I don't know if I'm going to call it unusual population, but that's awesome. A lot of my colleagues don't go below course level because they've never even thought about that. Is there an I think option? You can say I think. You can put that in the chat as an alternate. I will tell you a lot of faculty that are trained in their discipline and not necessarily in instructional methods have not ever heard of instructional learning objectives. I know when we've been doing these workshops and thinking about that, yeah, Melissa says over 30% don't use instructional learning objectives. So if that's you, that's not unusual. I think it's a lot more common than we think. Let's go to the next Menti question. If you use instructional learning objectives, we're curious where you get them. I know from my perspective, no one at my institution that I know of used instructional learning objectives. I had to write them myself. Provided as a standard curriculum from my colleagues, from my textbook. Yep. We did give an other in this case. There you go. We knew there'd be other places. All right. So as you finish putting that in, yeah, it's other where. You can throw that in the chat. We're always curious. All right. So one of the things that we wanted to ask you guys is, do you teach students how to use learning objectives? This was the subject of some papers that I found in my search for the literature. I see somebody saying we've determined them as a department.
Rebecca, can I chime in to answer Monica's question?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Monica. If your learning objectives and learning outcomes are aligned, a really nice match, they should sound very much like the same thing. We delineate a learning objective is a goal that as an instructor, I'm developing a course, I'm developing a lesson plan. These are my objectives for when I'm done with this, and I'm going to assess my students. This is my hope, my dream, my goals, where a learning outcome is actually what you got. So if you do have alignment in your assessments, your learning objectives and learning outcomes should look very much the same. And come off mute if that doesn't answer your question.
Thank you so much for answering my question right away. So you're saying the outcome is not what you hope the students will get at the end of the course, but what they actually do?
Right? Yeah.
I think we use them as what we expect they will do at the end of the course, traditionally, in the work that we do with faculty. Okay, so I guess we probably use then instructional learning objectives in your definition, but I've seen so many definitions of learning objectives and learning outcomes used interchangeably. So it was good that you clarified what you mean, but I wasn't sure I understood exactly your difference, but now I do very clearly. Thank you.
Perfect.
And that actually made doing the literature search really difficult. I want to throw in, because as I was looking at learning objectives, there wasn't a tremendous amount, and I expanded it to learning outcomes. And I found that a lot of people were talking about learning outcomes the same way that you would say learning objectives. And another, I guess, word or phrase used as a synonym is learning goals, which Melissa just said, you know, we use it as our goal. Formally, learning goals is a bigger, broader articulation of what you're hoping to do, and a learning objective is what's behavioral and measurable and attainable, whereas we might have bigger goals from which learning objectives stem. So there is in no way an agreement in the literature about one formal set of terms, which is why we in our article, and that's where I was trying to earlier, we just kind of came to an understanding and a declaration that we were going to use the word learning objectives, but you will often hear learning outcomes, learning goals. All right, I see some chat. Let me bring the chat up. So we have Rebecca, 57% teach students to use, okay. That means that teachers don't write learning outcomes. So that's an interesting question, Phoebe. Does that mean teachers don't write learning outcomes? We just measure them? And I think that's going to really depend on the institution, which is one of the reasons we ask the question of where do you get that? Where I'm from, we get course level learning objectives from the state. And then my instructional learning objectives are crafted by me, where I determine how am I going to get to these bigger course learning objectives. I'm really well aware that there are departments, I think I saw a comment in there that there's departments that write instructional learning objectives. There's institutions that will supply that as part of the curriculum. So I don't think that there's one answer for that either. What we're hoping to articulate is that we should be using instructional learning objectives no matter where we get them. And those instructional learning objectives should align with our course learning objectives. The instructional learning objectives are small, measurable steps to achieving the course learning objectives, which should be aligned with our programmatic learning objectives and with our institutional learning objectives. So there should be that vertical alignment, right? As well as we look at horizontal alignment. Those instructional learning objectives serve to help ensure that multiple sections of a course, say at a university, we might have 200 sections, they should be getting that same information. All right. Wording such as you will be able to. So we actually use the word the student should be able to avoid giving that promise, right? They should be able to if they are working on, and you just say, it is better to say, that's what we use. We should be able to. I'm going to go ahead and move on to teaching students, because this was something that I saw a theme, and it was really interesting because there's this idea that if you just use learning objectives and you align your instruction to the learning objectives, that the outcomes should improve, right? And what I saw in the literature is that that doesn't necessarily happen. One, if the instructor isn't aligning their instruction to those learning objectives, but two, if they're not teaching their students how to use those learning objectives. I, in my own personal experience, have noticed that my students tend to skip over the learning objectives, even though I give that to them and I tell them that if you look at these learning objectives and you can do these behaviors, then you will be successful on the test. You should use that as your guide. Students tell me they don't know how to use them. They tell me that most instructors just put them in there because it's an institutional requirement. So they should provide students opportunities to identify content, to organize studies, set their own goals. We can design activities for students to turn learning objectives into practice. And you can see some of the references that I put at the bottom of the slide, and we'll talk more about designing those activities. But the very first reference that I gave on how undergraduate science students use learning objectives is a really interesting read. It explores how they are using them and what we can do to teach them how to better use those learning objectives. So if you haven't, I saw about half of you have used, teach students how to use learning objectives. I would strongly advocate that you actively teach them how you're using the learning objectives in your planning of the course and how they can use those to improve their success. Wanted to take maybe a couple of minutes to just talk about that and let people weigh in. If you're one of those people that teaches your students, we'd love for you to come off mute and tell us how you do that. You can also drop it in the chat if you don't want to come off mute.
Rebecca, Captain Proton has a hand
Hi,
raised.
sorry. Well, just on that, you were asking for ways to incorporate that and teach them how to use. So one of the activities that I do is sort of a flip classroom, sort of pre-class reading and low level, a couple of low level question activity, but it's sort of wrapped in a metacognitive with a metacognitive activity where the last thing is to write something before you start reading about this topic, then sort of write something afterwards, a bit of a summary, and sort of compare those two. And in context, these are the learning objectives for this unit, and what do you think you need, where do you think you are in relation to this, and what do you think you need to work on? And then I republish those just as as we're approaching a unit test or a final exam.
Yeah, that's great. Making those learning objectives really visible to the students is it's supported by the literature, and constantly reinforcing that and reminding them that you're using the learning objectives to guide how your assessment will be done, and that's guiding how your instruction is planned, helps students in terms of preparing. It also makes the course more transparent to them. I know that students oftentimes are like, I don't know what's going to be on the test until I get that first exam. You'll hear students all the time saying, until I have the first exam, I don't really know how this is going to look. And so those learning objectives increase transparency. Judith says learning objectives are not only targets for the semester, but I think we have to propose student objectives for the week to help them monitor their attention and energy. Yeah, and one of the things that I found in the literature for some of the very successful reports of redesign around learning objectives is that people put the learning objectives, if they use PowerPoints, on the PowerPoint. And yes, Elizabeth, for every class, that is reported as being one of those evidence-based practices. If you have an activity for them, associating the learning objective, and again, I'll remind you, I'm talking instructional learning objective for every class, so that they can see that this is the behavior, the conditions, and the criteria that I'm going to assess you on in order to help you get to these learning outcomes that I expect. Just letting them know how the class is built and why that particular class activity is going to benefit them. All right, I'm going to move on because what I want to talk about kind of stems from this, and that is planning our assessment and planning activities. When you're planning assessments, so you've written your instructional learning objectives, which really is your roadmap. It's I have 101 instructional learning objectives to guide my course, and I teach majors biology. And then those 101 learning objectives are divided up by class session and by exam. The first thing you want to do is review your alignment of those instructional learning objectives with any course level or programmatic, and that's that vertical alignment I was discussing. In my course, all the instructional learning objectives are aligned to one of the course learning objectives that the state gives me and says is expected in order for transferability to other institutions of the state of Texas. And then to develop formative and summative assessments. And I mentioned that earlier. If you are expecting them to have this behavior, you want to be able to check it along the way, and that's that formative assessment process. And again, I really want to underscore that that doesn't have to be an actual quiz. You can formatively assess student progress in a lot of ways. And then summative assessments, which those also should align. If you're going to give a summative assessment where you're asking students to do something at a pretty high level of thinking, there should be formative practice. And one of the things we emphasize in our workshop is that they should have practice in the skill that you're planning in the summative assessment, in the formative, but that the scenario should vary. If you give them a scenario that they practice in the formative assessment that's identical in the summative assessment, you're not really doing a higher level thinking, you're just looking at recall. The performance and the conditions component should guide the assessment formats and how you do that. If you're going to ask them to make a speech, for instance, as part of a learning objective, then they should get the opportunity to make that speech. It shouldn't be a multiple choice question. So you have to align that as well. When we talk about activities, so we have our assessment plan. We're going to plan instructional activities. Those learning objectives should be the framework for building the course activities. One of the things we have in our article is kind of a triangular figure where we think about learning objectives, assessments, and activities in a bit of a triangle to show that they're all related. I found a couple of really interesting articles that are in the evidence-based teaching guide about using pretests to focus student attention on the learning objective, which I found intriguing. And they basically reported taking the learning objectives and turning them into pretests for their students so that students are not just getting exposed to the learning objectives, but taking advantage of that testing as a learning event where they're answering questions, very low stakes or no stakes, but they're answering questions to start to cement the expectation that this is something they should be able to do by the end of the unit or by the end of the class session or by the end of a module. The evidence or the literature supports being very explicitly in articulating learning objectives. And there's a lot of literature that discusses how when a course is built on backward design, where the learning objectives are prioritized and the activities are aligned to those learning objectives, there's more time for active learning activities, or as Captain Proton was talking about, maybe a flipped classroom approach where they're doing things rather than just taking in material. And there's articles at the bottom here. The SANA reference talks about some of the pre-tests. Reynolds gave a really nice planning tool for how to construct a course in this way. And Armbruster is a reference that just talked about their implementation of this process and some of the results they saw. All right, before we move away from learning objectives, I wanted to give you a chance to throw in the chat, throw in the Menti, what your key takeaway about aligning assessment and activities with learning objectives is. I'm gonna check on my time. While you throw that in the chat. Oh, good, we're good. And again, on the Menti, if you haven't been in there, the code is at the very, very top of the slide where it tells you the website and the code. Students aware of the LOs. There was quite a good bit of evidence that talked about how the efficacy of using learning objectives decreases significantly when students aren't aware of that. A lot of people have never considered involving their students. I found a lot of students read through the learning objectives and ignore them because they're not used to that actually being part of the planning. Let's see. Ensure that you'll be measuring attainment of learning outcomes and not measuring something else. Yeah, there was an article in the evidence-based teaching guide that actually talks about how students can discern between the stated learning objectives and the implied learning objectives. It was very interesting because they said they'll read the learning objectives in the syllabus, but then the instructor is teaching to what they call the implied learning objectives, and students very quickly figure out which ones are real or important based on what the instruction is addressing. Ensure it's a way to support improvements, yes, to make every learning objective current and relevant. And that's something, again, to use your assessment data to go and revise your learning objectives. Maybe you'll find that a learning objective wasn't attainable. And when we talk about attainable, is can they do that within the course session or within the course itself? All right, let's transition to items. We want to talk about items. And so the first question we wanted to ask you is just your familiarity with these selected response item types. So we've got multiple choice, alternate choice, multiple true false, matching, complex, dependent item or item set. Not surprisingly, we have a 5 for multiple choice and 4.1 for matching. Very good. We anticipated that some of these might not be as familiar to you. So we're going to give a moment for you to review these. It's kind of a pause and reflect review moment. We're going to show you the types of selected response items that are recommended versus not recommended. And I believe you have a PDF that you can open to look at these different selected response items. So we go and look at the recommended versus not recommended list, which is on the next slide. All right, I'm going to go ahead and give you a couple of minutes, and I'm going to start my timer so that you can look through that. Take about 15 seconds longer. All right, so we focused on selected response items and began with what's recommended and not recommended, mainly so that everyone knows there's more than just multiple choice. One of the things that we have is alternate choice, which a lot of faculty do not use. And some of this is going to kind of pave the way for the item writing checklist. I saw a question. We've designed a type of question called error detection. Where would those fit? Maybe Elizabeth, you can tell me what error detection, what kind of question that is, because I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, there are kinds of questions. I'm thinking from reading your description, they may be the last one, sort of context dependent ones, because they're a bit of a vignette, I guess. But it's basically taking what students typically the types of responses that students have demonstrated previously, many types of errors. And so we use those in future tests or assessments, I don't mean tests, but in future assessments to ask students can they recognize where the error might have cropped up, like if it's problem solving, or if it's a full-blown solution, where is the error, or what is the common error? It's almost like asking students to correct themselves or a peer.
So I think that kind of question could be written in a variety of different ways. The complex dependent item and item set tends to be, and by the way, I should specify this, these types is straight from Michael's book, the guide for writing college item writing. And I'm getting the name wrong, but Michael's book, which Melissa can put that in the chat, what the actual name is. But one of the things that he talks about is how when you have your students read a large scenario or vignette, as you said, and they're going to have to interpret something. They're going to have to think about and maybe do some higher level questions. Coming up with an item set where you use the same figure or the same problem or the same scenario and you ask multiple questions can lower the cognitive load of giving them different scenarios for every question. It also allows you to build in levels of higher level thinking. So you might ask a basic question, maybe a recall, knowledge, comprehension question, and then build as they're interpreting that. I think that could be one of the error detection type of questions. I can also see you doing error detection through alternate choice or many choice. So I think the goal is for them to figure out what the misconceptions are, and that can be done with a number of these different types of responses. Okay, I'm going to move to our next slide because what I want to do is tie this together with the whole first part of this webinar, and that is looking at what kind of learning objectives can you measure using selected response. Because some learning objectives are better measured using selected response than other types of learning objectives. So if we go to the next slide, there's a nice compare and contrast. Yeah. So you can see that if you're asking students to perform a task, if you have a nursing student where they're having to put in an ID, a multiple choice or a selected response of any type wouldn't actually measure the learning objective. It's not having them do the performance stated by the learning objective. On the other hand, solving problems, interpreting displays, drawing inferences from data, analyzing conditions, all of these can be done well with selected response questions. And I think a lot of faculty tend to think that selected response is lower level thinking. And what we wanted to get at was how to write selected response questions that could measure higher level thinking. And that's one of the things we do in the workshop. Some of the benefits of selected response items, we have some advantages and disadvantages for these benefits. And Melissa will give us the benefits. There we go. The advantages, it can allow you to easily score. We saw in Melissa's data, you know, if you have 500 students, which Peggy, my colleague that does these workshops with me, has many students. It's much easier to score. It's efficient for large classes. Students are really familiar with a lot of types. Can be used to measure a lot of different objectives. There are disadvantages. As Melissa stated, it can take an hour to write one good assessment question, and it can be very much affected by students' reading skills. It doesn't always reflect real world problem solving. What I want to make clear is we're not advocating that all of your assessments should be selected response items, but what we do want to get at is that selected response items can provide a format for assessment of not just low-level questions, but or low-level thinking, but also higher-level thinking. Which brings us to the item writing checklist, and I'm really excited to share this with you. And I'm excited because this was can be life-changing for you. The item writing checklist is also from Tony and Michael's book, and these recommendations really help your selected response items to be more informative to your instruction. They will promote construction of items that remove obstacles that prevent knowledgeable students from getting that item right. In other words, you don't want things in your question that could trick a prepared student into selecting an incorrect answer, but you also want to remove clues that might result in the unprepared student from getting that item right. Some students are pros at reading question types. One of my offspring is an example of that. she can get any question right by reading the question and spotting the flaws. So we really want to think about the content concerns, how we format the question, how we write the stem, and how we write the options. So we're going to do another 2 minutes to pause and let you read through these item writing checklist. And as you're reading through it, I'd like you to think about being prepared to discuss something that maybe you didn't know. You didn't even know that that was not recommended, or that it was recommended. Maybe something that that you found that you do that is not recommended. And I can share with you one of the things I found as I was reviewing the item writing checklist. I know Peggy, when we were reviewing it in 2019, we just looked at each other and went, uh-oh. So just as you're taking that 2 minutes, think about those two things. And we'll start now, just reviewing that checklist.
Sue or Phoebe's going to drop that in, but before they do so, one thing I wanted to mention about the complex dependent set that wasn't mentioned is when we think about higher level questions, they often require, like Liz mentioned, a vignette or some data. That takes a fair amount of time for students to comprehend what's going on with that complex set, with that complex item. So the recommendation is, if they're going to have to invest a fair amount of time into that complex item, it should be a set of questions that go along with it, so that the investment for reading is returned by having multiple questions involved in taking the time to read that. If that's helpful, a higher level question that is closed response should take a student about 60 to 90 seconds to answer. And if you give them a lot of reading, then they're going to spend the time on that. So having 3 to 5 questions that go with it is beneficial.
All right, I'm going to restart that time. So you have actually full 2 minutes to read. All right, about 10 more seconds. All right, so we have set up a Menti for you to relay your key takeaways. And again, that can be something that surprised you, something that you're guilty of, As you're writing in, I can share one of mine, and maybe Melissa will share one of hers. I always tell people I was the embedded blank queen, meaning I would construct questions where there were embedded blanks in the middle of the prompt, which Michael and Tony looked at us and looked rather horrified and said, when you write a STEM, it should be a complete sentence or complete thought. It can be a whole question, or it can have them finish the question, but there should never be embedded blanks. That really raises the cognitive load, which sent me back revising every single quiz question and exam question that I had. Well, every single quiz and test that I had, looking for those. Use of negative statements. That's a really common, because it's so much easier to list true things and then maybe say except. All of these are true except. Coming up with, I guess, plausible distractors is difficult. One of the things, though, that I will say is one of my really big key takeaways is that I only needed 3 options. As Michael told us, over 40 years of evidence and literature tells us that you really only need 3 options. You need 1 correct answer and then 2 distractors that would be common student misconceptions. And one of the things that it taught me is, as I was writing my questions, to write my distractors with the intention of identifying misconceptions that my students have. What incorrect statements or distractors do I want to find out whether my students hold? And in fact, the distractors are now often called attractors. I like to see that 3 options is sufficient. It is hard to come up with 4 plausible distractors. And one of the things we talk about in our workshop is when you do item analysis, to look for your distractors that don't attract any student responses. Having 4 or 5 options adds to the cognitive load of your test. It adds to the amount of reading that your students have to do. And by trimming it down to 3, you can actually ask more questions because you're using those words that they have to read in a more valuable way. I'm glad to see this in line with the guidelines provided in the workshop given by. I'm glad to. I'm a big fan of none of the above. If it doesn't give us that much information on what we want to revise in our instruction. Yes, it adds to the cognitive load. Can you use the multiple true false format to replace the negative statements? Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the wonderful things about multiple true false is if you're trying to get them to decide or tell you about whether or not they hold this misconception or not, multiple true false is a great option for that. All right, so we have 8 minutes left for questions. And I think Elizabeth asked us to leave 10 to 15. So hopefully this is enough. I'm going to stop talking and turn it back over to you guys for questions and anything that you want to say.
I would just add, Sue just dropped the entire workbook into the chat. So if you want to grab that document, we haven't published it anywhere yet. So that will be useful information for you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'll turn my video on. But anyone else can jump in here. Something I've spoken with people about it at other workshops, or this idea of all students come from different backgrounds and have varying experiences, and when we try to bring a new context into a question on an assessment, particularly a summative assessment, there's a risk that some students just don't have experience with that particular context. Is that something, because you guys are designing a question bank, so I'm interested in that's something you've been considering and how you avoid it, because we have such varied backgrounds with our students.
Yeah, so that is a good question. And I might ask you to elaborate, and like if I'm not answering your question, like let me know. So we have an internal document called an inclusive language guide, where we look at terminology that will be a challenge for international students or regional students to be really careful about that terminology. But when you say they might not be familiar with the context, or I'm going to go to biology because that's the world that I live in. But are you talking about, if I'm talking about a lake ecosystem and they've never seen a lake before? Okay, yeah. So we talk about that a lot. If you want it to be a novel situation, that's actually useful, right? If they can contextualize, okay, I'm looking at this ecosystem and I have no idea what they're talking about, but I know fundamentally the rules of 10. Therefore, I can apply, it's an ecosystem. I see a food chain. I can apply the rules of 10, even though I don't know what these organisms are. A good question should enable the student, if the question is well constructed, even if they don't know the context itself, that's the novel situation component that is higher order. What a lot of faculty will do is they will take a place-based situation, they will teach it in their instruction, and then they'll assess on it. And they've lowered the level of blooms because really it's just recall at that point. But with the tool that we are creating, the professional development associated with it is important that they pick terms that their students are familiar with. So there's training around, like, you need to keep the fundamental stem of this question this way because it's been peer reviewed and it's getting at the learning objective. But if there's terms in there, everything is editable, that they can change it to a term that they would use in their course so that the terms themselves aren't causing the confusion. Is that answering your question, Phoebe?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in physics, there's so many physical situations that we assume our students know, like, shooting things, for example. And some do and some don't. So you get a really varied understanding, and the ones that have experience with that particular context are able to perform at a higher level.
Yeah.
Because they're already advanced.
Yeah, they're able to perform at a higher level because the cognitive load is actually lower for them.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's always going to be an issue. And the questions that we are designing are intended. What faculty end up doing with them, we have no idea. They are intended to improve student learning by giving students the opportunity to engage with many types of questions under the same learning objective. And so hopefully, if it's powerful, right? But if used correctly, it should decrease that inequity that you would see by just not being exposed.
Beth has her hand
Beth
up.
has a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. It's a little off topic, sort of. With the higher quality selective response questions, and you're right, they're very familiar in biology, and we're judged sometimes by departments that don't use them as often, but we'll put that to the side. Something we've been experimenting with in our department is allowing students to use memory aids. So to come in with a memory aid, even with in-person learning. And it was in part precipitated with online learning. We changed our question types because now these were open book assessments and we were writing them as open book. And we're looking at the memory aids to help with anxiety, to help as a really powerful learning tool as students are preparing for an exam, to recognize what they know, what they don't know, a little bit as, creating your own dictionary type situation. So there's a lot that goes in there. And I guess the question is, if you've written this thinking critical type question that we're talking about today, do you think a memory aid allows for or hampers your ability to test if the students comprehend and understand that learning objective?
I'll answer, and then Rebecca, you can answer. So like, I have not done research on this, but I will tell you from my experience, I don't have a problem with a memory aid. So all of my tests are open resource. And so that tells you about the types of questions that I ask. I think the best way to gauge if students are learning, and this is just me talking, is how dependent are they on the learning aid, right? I mean, if it's taking them 10, 15, 20 minutes to answer a question because they're looking in that tool, that aid, to find the resources that they need, then its effectiveness has gone down. If they are looking at a question and they're like, oh my gosh, I know this is on page 384, and I just need to look at this one graphic, I think learning has happened in the way that you want it, in the way that we use it in the lab, right? I mean, think of how often you quickly look something up, you know it, but it's quicker to look it up. I'm okay with that. Rebecca, you want to add?
Oh, I'm thinking through it. I think it always comes back to what your learning objectives are, right? If they need to know that as something that is a go-to, I don't know, reference point in their head, maybe you don't want to give them a learning aid. But if the point of this is for them to use a set of materials that they'll be given, right, and they've got to do something novel with it, then I think a memory aid is perfectly appropriate. One of the things that I've done is allowed students to create a memory aid and bring it into an exam, and they get really, really frustrated with me because they'll say, I didn't even need the whole note card that I made because I knew all of that. And of course, my thought is, you knew it because you interacted with the material to the point where you made choices as to what you were going to bring, because you learned it, right? And they don't realize that creating that, if you're having them create a memory aid, is a learning event. I think what Melissa said is right, and it just depends on what they need to know. I mean, there's going to be times when they need to know things without looking it up, if that's one of your learning objectives, and you wouldn't want them to bring that in. But there should be, I hope, lots of opportunities for them to use knowledge in thinking more critically, and that would be appropriate.
I just add, I like to describe it to my personal kids and my students. You know, when I start my car every day, I'm able to start it. If I had to get out the manual every single time I wanted to start my car,
yeah,
I might start to make some judgments as to whether or not that's the best use of like something I should put in my long-term memory. If it's something like in my context, knowing it independent and variable, you are going to see that over and over and over again. You just have to learn it because you're going to spend too much time going back to see what it is. So for me, it's the rate of return. How often am I going to see this, and what am I going to do with it?
I used to teach pharmacology to nursing students, and I would tell them, you know, you're legally responsible, at least here in the States, you're legally responsible for every drug you give, and you need to recognize a doctor's error in dosage just by looking at it. And if you don't have that working knowledge, you're going to kill someone, and then you're going to end up getting disbarred or maybe in jail. And so, you know, because they would get very upset that I made them learn these things without a memory aid, because they would say, I can always look it up. I said, you can't look up everything, right? You would not be nursing if you were looking with a book in front of you. So Melissa's an example is really good. If you had to look up how to turn your car, and I always ask them, if you have to look up your name, that's a problem too. But they just know their name. So
All right, we are at time, so I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you all so much. I hope this was helpful, and don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions or ideas at all. And if you're a bio person and you want to submit questions, please reach out to me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Rebecca. That was fantastic and thought-provoking.